Welcome to Masculinity 98. Thanks for joining us. Today we have a very special guest. It's a long friend of mine since high school, since middle school, I'd say, or even before.
Mhm.
It's William Berganzo. He's going to be speaking about his experience with trans masculinity. And among that, we're going to just learn about his journey. It's going to be really interesting. Thank you to everyone that has been soliciting this episode. And we're going to do it in English since he's more comfortable with English and we want to get the best experience possible. Even I believe most of my audience is bilingual. So yeah, let's get to it. Hi, William. How are you?
Sick. Hello, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. To start off, anything you want to say before we start?
No, not particularly. I mean, I'm open to pretty much any question because I find that my intention in talking to people is hopefully to educate if there's ever a question about anything, and I like being open. I don't really feel embarrassment in that regard. So honestly, feel free to ask me whatever. I don't mind.
Okay, perfect. Well, we already had some pre-recorded questions we were thinking about doing. So let's start with the first one. How did you discover the concept of masculinity?
Well, I'm constantly redefining the concept of masculinity for myself as the years go by. As a child, I could discern the masculine vibe from the feminine, especially my single digit years, mainly because I was constantly limited by the enforcement of the binary as a young girl. But when you think about it as a concept and consequently trying to find a definition that I feel appropriate, I don't think I got around to thinking about this until high school, puberty. And I generally accepted most things I encountered in my life. So I just accepted that while the masculine was not directly opposite the feminine, there was a fluctuating balance between the two. In terms of if we were to put in a concept, or if we were to put like an unequal sign next to it, for me, in a very crude, summarized manner, would be maturity. That's my, like, if you were to choose one word and then you start branching off in like one of those diagrams, that's probably going to be at the center for me.
Okay. It's interesting how you say you discovered the concept or could identify aspects of it in your single digit years. And
Mhm.
it's also interesting how you define it as maturity, because I too agree with you that it's not like a dichotomy. It's not the antithesis of femininity. It's like I feel like it's more of a spectrum. You cherry pick what aspects of social behavior you want to implement on yourself in terms of gender expression. And it's interesting because you say maturity, and I'm like, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer because it's very individual to the person, but I would understand how you would come to that conclusion because it's like, okay, well, you're cherry picking your own gender expression, and it's like, okay, well, what is masculinity to you? Well, okay, well, it evolved from this basically. You're saying it ramifies. It permeates from the concept of maturity. So, okay, in terms of the concept of masculinity, how was it for you before, during, and after transitioning?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I do think about that a lot, mainly because I like to reflect in how I've perceived my ideas transforming over the years. Because, like I
Mhm.
said, I'm constantly redefining masculinity for myself. I would say that before, my conception of masculinity was more aesthetic than anything at the time. You're fairly young, you're thinking about what you're seeing and not really necessarily thinking about the depths of experience and the depths of emotions. You're just, taking things in. And so for me, it was very aesthetic in regarding in ways of dress, in ways of expression, appearance, things like that. So I was mainly concerned with what I was able to wear and what I felt suited me best rather than being dressed in an appropriate way for a girl at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and so because my kind of self-expression was something that remains kind of lacking in my life for a while, because part of your identity is founded on the concept of you, and my concept of myself did not match everybody else's concepts, but I still didn't know why. And I had no idea that it had to do with gender. Um, and so I was concerned with wearing plain pants rather than pants with glitter or butterflies on it. Not specifically because I had anything against glitter or butterflies, but because they were associated with the same constricting gender role, I guess, that I found myself placed into without my choosing, of course. Mainly for me, it was like, I want to play with these specific toys rather than those toys for just because, and I want to wear this rather than that. So it was very superficial, much more concerned with the way that I present myself. It sort of changed a bit in, I would say it changed in regards to a masculine ideal because during was, well, when I was going into my college years, so right after high school, when I started thinking about the concept of masculinity. And so throughout my transition, I was able to get a taste of like confidence, which is a quality I often associate with my masculine ideal. And so at the time, it no longer seemed to be aesthetic as I remember it feeling at first. I was feeling then the difference between being treated as a man rather than a woman. And frankly, it was a very frustrating experience. Um, Not for me, but because kind of entering this new this new way in which people would perceive me. And of course, perception is everything. And so being perceived as a man, I was given certain privileges that women were not given. And that was very apparent to me, coming from the other side, if you want to put it that way. And so specifically what I found with the conception of masculinity at the time was a lot of toxicity. Um, and what I mean, toxicity is involved with our ideas and conceptions of masculinity, um, which make no sense a lot of the time to me. Um, and and I've accepted the fact that I personally might not fit another person's ideal of masculinity, but or manliness, but I don't really care at that point when I'm transitioning. I don't really care. I was secure and confident in my identity, especially because it was physically I was finally matching that. And I was very lucky in the sense that I found that I passed very easily as a cisgender man. Um, Even before my voice started to change. I mean, I'm kind of a quiet dude, so long as I keep my mouth closed, especially at that time, it was kind of hard to tell um, when I was just socially transitioning rather than physically in hormone replacement therapy. And so during that change, which is still going on to this day, of course, but the initial years are definitely the most dramatic. So besides observing and acknowledging the existence of that toxicity that I was talking about, um, which seemed really the most illogical way or illogical approach to living, gave me the push I needed to pursue the study and understanding psychologically of masculinity. So, what constitutes masculinity? What is the thought process? What are the patterns in behavior? Um, and in wanting to learn about that and reading about that, I realized that it's not necessarily something that you attain through hormone therapy and through social transition. It's more of a spiritual transition, if you want to put it that way, because there's multiple facets to gender, to masculinity overall. Um, First of all, there's the discovery for me. I discovered that it was a spectrum, and as a result, there's multiple dimensions. I had finally reached the aesthetic, the levels of priority where um, when you're transitioning, social is the main aspect of it. Because when you are in a social situation, you find yourself kind of reflected back at you in the way that you interact with people, in the way that interaction brings out certain aspects of the world. And so being physically transitioned meant that I no longer had to worry about passing. I no longer had to worry about going to the bathroom, which was kind of annoying for a little while, especially because of the HB2 law that was passed during that time in North Carolina. I'm still transitioning now when I'm post all of those, most of those changes, and have been living as a guy for, I want to say, how long has it been? Probably,
6,
I would say
7
like
years?
6 years. Yeah. Yeah, like 6 years. Been in hormone therapy for about five now. Um, it's something that I don't really think about that much anymore. Um, I do think about it in social situations, especially when I interact with other guys. It's kind of in my mind mainly because I feel so out of place, but it's not a lack of confidence. It's more of like, um, it's not that I don't feel that I belong because of my gender or my conception of masculinity. It's more like I don't really have much to relate to you on, actually, other than we're dudes, but I can't even relate on a physical, like completely physical, biological way. It wasn't mainly for the social aspect. I realized that it was more for in order to fulfill my own understanding of myself.
You bring up a lot of valid points. I was just mentally taking notes. Since before you were talking about when you were like younger in your teenage years before transitioning, it was interesting how you observed um, female female expressions of gender as like a
Hmm.
type of cage. And
Hmm.
you mentioned the glitter on the pants. It's not anything against glitter. It's mainly it just
Hmm.
represented a stage of your life in which you weren't what you truly thought you should be. And that's
Hmm.
completely valid because it's not like, ah, ew, glitter, whatever. It's simply like what it
Yeah.
represents, basically.
Hmm.
So it's very
Yeah.
interesting. And the it's great that with the idea of starting to accept reality and reality being your gender identity and expression, you gain confidence. And it isn't cockiness or anything, it's confidence to start a type of process of introspection, be it spiritually, physically, mentally, psychologically, and all that stuff, which is part of the basic human experience. But in this case, it was a basic, it was more focused on this type of transition journey. And then the really interesting, oh, by the way, what's the HB2 law in North Carolina? I don't know about that.
Oh,
If
I'm
you could,
sorry.
yeah.
The HB2 law, I think it was, I don't know if it was in effect 2017, 2018,
Mhm.
um, around that time. But it was essentially as I was coming into college, and the law involved transgender people being legally required to go into the bathroom corresponding to gender assigned at birth. So essentially the sex rather than gender. Um, and that was kind of a mess because it didn't really make any sense. Um, and it was kind of very difficult to enforce as well.
Yeah, 'cause
Um,
are they gonna check your pants and see what genitals you have? Like, you could be
exactly.
intersex, you could have something else, you know.
Exactly. And that is never appropriate. So it was kind of a pointless law in a way. Um, but I was kind of scared that I don't know, that I'd be reported or something. So I did
Get in
go
trouble or
into
something.
the ladies' room. Yeah, I did go into the ladies' room a couple times as I was socially transitioning. So initially, I appeared as a dude. I confused a lot of ladies, but it was fine. They just kind of looked at me like, "Oh, you're one of those," and I'd be like, "I'm sorry," and then I was like, "Huh." I've come to realize dudes don't care because I've gone into the men's room and they don't even look at me.
No one cares.
So
They're
really,
there
it
to
was
pee,
mainly
wash their hands, and leave. Like it's not a social gathering in the
exactly,
bathroom.
exactly. And it's kind of a different experience in the woman's bathroom. Um, there are conversations that take place there and exchange of toiletries at times, you know, it's it's nice. It's nice. I just don't want anybody to talk to me. I just want to do my thing. So,
Mhm.
um, that environment didn't really, among other things, it didn't necessarily feel right for me. But um, yeah, nobody really cared. So, and essentially, those laws were more geared towards male to female transgender people.
Yep.
Um,
Because the whole
and
men in transition
because
need to be
the
predators and aggressors and stuff like that
exactly.
mentality, which is a projection of their own toxic dark masculinity. But that's another topic for another
Ex
day.
exactly. And um, it's funny because there have been no reports. If there have been more than a small handful of reports of there actually being assaults in situations like that, where a man comes into the bathroom dressed as a woman, you know, because they think more of trans dressers, cross dressers.
Yes.
They think more of cross dressers than transgender people at that point.
It's a
Um,
straw man
it
argument, honestly. It's crazy.
So yeah, it didn't last long, thankfully, but it was difficult for a lot of people that were pre-transitioning, and I saw that in my friends. People didn't suspect me that easily because I was very narrow. I didn't have wider hips like some of my friends, and I didn't have more of a shapely frame like some of my friends. So it's definitely easier for some people to pass than others. Um, and I was definitely lucky in that sense, but I got to see what it does to people that aren't so lucky in that sense.
No, it's it's interesting, but more than interesting, it's frustrating. It's enraging. The fact
Mhm.
that you
Yes.
were in a point where you were visibly one didn't have to doubt if you were a man or not. You just went by. You were a little bit more reserved, not so extroverted, so no one had the chance to like, catch something, I guess. And it was funny because
Hmm.
the women, when you came into the
Yeah.
bathrooms, they saw you as a man because that confrontation, like, what are you doing here?
Hmm.
It's because they perceive you as a man.
Hmm.
Therefore, you could have gone
Hmm.
unnoticed to the bathroom because masculine dynamics in the bathroom, we don't talk to each other. Like even in the
Hmm.
stalls, there's one stall
Exactly.
between each guy. Like we're not there to talk. It's
Hmm.
basically like traditionally speaking. Yeah, we're there. We do our thing. We some wash their hands, some don't, and then we just leave. It's not a social
Hmm.
interaction. No one's looking over the stalls to see. Oh, that's not the genital corresponding to this according to the law. That's you're breaking. No, like no one cares. No one perceives that. It's I don't know. It's a crazy dynamic. But yeah, but
Indeed.
on that note too, it's it's genuinely interesting how you've you've had experiences in the in female presenting um pre-transition period of your life, and you were exposed to feminine dynamics, be it positive or negative, between the whole experience of discovering masculinity, comparing it to femininity and all that stuff. You had those experiences in a female presenting dynamic, and then you transition and you were exposed to male dynamics, like including the bathroom, the one that we already mentioned, but how you were treated. You say you're more like like calm, present, in terms of how you express your social interactions. Um, how would you compare? Would you say there's something you had to like, oh, this is a very important thing when you differentiate the feminine experiences versus the masculine?
Hmm. Well, definitely there must be extremes even to a spectrum. And so I kind of think of if I were to think of an extreme, I would think of the more negative aspects.
Yeah.
specifically because um, negative aspects are generally come from a place of narrow thinking. Let's think of the spectrum as like a wire. So the middle of the wire, of course, is going to be a little bit more flexible, less taut than the rest of the wire, than the extremes, which are attached to something, which in that case would be, I guess, yeah, it would be like a post-labeled um, ego, perhaps. I say that because it would definitely be that lack of understanding, I guess, that I was kind of trying to mention earlier, the flexibility, mainly because a lot of toxic masculine traits are unfeeling with no sympathy, can be rude, rough. And so I I compared that to the other side of the coin. If we're thinking in black and white, two sides of a coin, that's the easiest way to think of concepts in order to differentiate between the two. And so the other side was a tender, nurturing, more loving side. But obviously, that doesn't necessarily apply to every case. And so, um, in my case, differentiating between the two, of course, was mainly more aesthetic at first. So to me, the opposite of pants was a skirt, and vice versa. Same with like a dress. And so I began to compare things like that at a very simple at a very simple level, and then to the slightly deeper level when we're talking about more personality and qualities. I would think of the feminine in a more nurturing light, and then the more masculine in a more. The thing is, masculinities can also be nurturing. So it doesn't necessarily, well, when thinking about the concept, it kind of becomes difficult to distinguish without using words like self-willed and self-indulgent, versus, I guess, sympathetic. You know, that's not necessarily the right way to think about it because interestingly enough, as a child, I kind of viewed the, if you were to put it like in the good and bad extreme,
Mhm.
there were most of the traits I found in men were aligned with the more negative light, and then the positive in the female extreme or the feminine extreme. And so obviously that wasn't all there was to it. But if I wanted to think of two sides of a coin, well, I differentiated man from being, let's say, proud and arrogant versus a woman who was usually in a position of a more submissive position, and a more self-aware position. So that dynamic of oppression was kind of what modeled, or not modeled, but molded that differentiating between the two.
And it's interesting because if we're a spectrum from positive experiences to negative experiences, I'd say the negative would be the more standard expressions of
Mm-hmm,
masculinity, the more traditional hegemonic expressions of toxic
mm-hmm,
masculinity, I'd say. Meanwhile, the positive
mm-hmm,
experiences would be the more alternative aspects of masculinity, the healthier version, if so.
mm-hmm,
Because you say, for example, caring, that men can be caring. It's interesting because I've had this conversation a few times with different friends that their masculinity in itself isn't toxic. There are certain aspects of the masculine experience that are taken to a limit that makes them toxic. Because you're important, for example, the provider role. Toxic masculinity would have you believe that that is essential, and your masculinity and your worth as a man is based on how good you can provide. But what's behind the idea of providing? It's care. It's taking care of those you love or those you appreciate. And if you see it in a positive light, it's nurturing the ones you care about, be it in a monetary sense or like shelter, emotions, warmth, you know. And when you parallel that with traditional feminine roles, you see that the mother instinct, but in its core, they're both searching for nurture to those people they value in their life. In terms of the family structure with the role of the provider and the mother instinct, it's part of the structure of the traditional family, one would say, but both are stemming from the same origin. you know, Thing is,
Mm-hmm.
society happens, and then you get the negative experiences. Then you get the in terms of women, you see women that don't express the desire to be a mother, and then they're like, then what are you then? What are you gonna do with your life
Right.
if you're not a mother? And you see the family con
Mm-hmm.
I see that a lot in Latino families, Latino households, that when are you gonna give me the grandchild or something?
Mm-hmm.
They just expect you're gonna be a mother. As well with men, they just expect you have to be the
Mm-hmm.
provider. You have to pay for everything. You have to protect. You have to be physically imposing. You have to earn more than your partner. You have to be taller than your partner. It's crazy. It's okay if you're ugly, but your partner has to be beautiful, and you have to be rich. Like if you're ugly, then you're rich.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a whole lot of experiences, but it is interesting when you mention it because I do go back to those conversations that there are very basic, primitive human needs, such as nurture, that we have inside of us, and we manifest them in different ways depending on our experiences, stimuli, and how we process the information given to us by society. So yeah, but in terms of switching to another question, I'd like, and we mentioned already toxic masculinity. Do you feel like you practice any type of toxic masculine traits and stuff? Because I feel like it permeates so deeply in every aspect of society and behavior and social interactions that no one is really safe. Be it a person from the LGBTQ plus
Mm-hmm.
community, being a person like I identify as a straight cis man, but and I'm trying to go hard on my deconstruction process to say per se, but I know it's not a destiny. It's more of a trajectory type of thing because I'll never be fully
Mm-hmm.
deconstructed. There are things that I still do that I'm like, that's kind of chauvinist. You shouldn't analyze that. But it's so permeated in how I am as a person and how I was brought up that, like it's a constant process because you're always discovering something. So yeah, on behalf of that, would you say you have toxic masculine traits? And if so, then what would those be?
Yeah, no, definitely. I try very hard to be self-aware and mindful of exercising these patterns of conduct, but most of the time I see it arise in the form of emotional repression. This has been one of the weirdest changes since I began transitioning. I feel like I've lost the ability to cry, like physically cry. And it's not that the feelings aren't there, it's that the tears will not fall. They can well up in my eyes, but they will not fall. It's very weird, and it feels like my tear ducts are constipated. And it's like, even physically, my body makes it more difficult to release said emotions. Um, and never mind the toxic traits and that we find in masculinity of just get over it, or or don't be a crybaby, boys don't cry. We've all heard that. Well, that's definitely been something that I've been struggling with myself. So what I've noticed is thought and emotion have shifted drastically for me. So not necessarily in matter of in order of importance, but more like in the ways that I've begun to think and the ways that I've begun to act. And so it's not that I tell myself that I shouldn't cry, but more like I can whine about this later. I have to find a way out. I can't be so pathetic. So it's more like the mentality of carrying on without stopping to acknowledge my own feelings, which left untouched tend to make me implode, which then results in me making a long list of decisions I later regret because I allowed my emotions to control me instead of controlling them. So that loss of control due to a constant repression of my emotions and my needs. And maybe in a way, it's an unconscious fear of being perceived as weak. But it's interesting because conceptually, I don't associate weakness with feeling or emotion or sensitivity. I don't necessarily that they're not mutually exclusive for me. So it's interesting because I'll have to constantly try to talk myself into what I know I believe versus what my unconscious mind continues to try to exercise, which is that repression of like conceal, don't feel. You must present as a strong person capable of making tough decisions, of being courageous. And so, yes, those are things that I associate with masculinity, but um, it's also taken to an extreme in the ways that I have, um, whether intentionally or not, can be very toxic, but toxic on your own person. So as a result, in not allowing myself to feel my emotions as they come, kind of putting them on the back burner, because I mean, it's good to acknowledge your feelings as not always yours, not always align yourself with your emotions, given that they are chemical processes in your body. But thinking of them as chemical processes in your body will only lead you to assume that none of them matter. And some of them do because they're there for a reason. And ignoring them is not more no more helpful to you in your own personal growth than acknowledging at each and every one of them. And so what that's resulted in for me has been uh, a quickness to frustration and anger that I did not experience before. I have grown very impatient. Um, And so impatience eventually leads to that frustration to anger, and maybe anger could even result in aggression. In terms of healthy masculinity, well, I think of it as I did mention maturity earlier, about if I were to kind of like have a conception of masculinity, but that's more like the actual healthy masculinity. Um, because masculinity among men often when the ones we see exhibiting toxic behaviors are essentially boys who never quite grew up, never reached that maturity stage. Um, and so, for example, there's this dude whose name is James F. Clark. He's great. He gave this little speech to young men about being a true man, true manliness. And one of the things that he said was a false notion of manliness leads boys astray. And that's definitely true. And so the he differentiated true manliness and false manliness, but it sounds to me more like the true masculine, he's aligning with not emotions, traits such as tenderness and loving, um, and then the false manliness being as kind of cold and cynical and even contemptuous. And so, in terms of healthy masculinity, I think of it as exhibiting traits of maturity, of kindness, and courage. I mentioned courage earlier. I say courage because essentially it's to rise up in time of need and have the capability to do the thing that needs to be done in spite of that fear. Um, and in order to reach that goal, one must be also patient and humble. Those are the things that I consider are present in practicing healthy masculinity. Um, because at least the way that I see it, one should seek to understand rather than to oppose in order to further solidify one's conception of one's ego. And so, in terms of healthy masculinity, things that I try to keep, um, things that I try to practice is that patience, but patience rooted in not necessarily taking anything personally. So usually I see toxic traits of masculinity coming through when they feel that there's something that they need to prove or something in their ego that needs to be solidified in order for their conception of themselves to be stable in a time of instability, such as um, when somebody points something out that might ring true to you, um, or when somebody challenges your conception of yourself. And so um, I say that it's important for me to practice not taking things personally because in reality, not everyone is out to get you. So there's no need to be on guard or to be ready to prove someone wrong simply because I have the guts to do it. For me, it's about learning to pick my battles as well as my interests and ways to invest my time. So, in other words, um, to be mature and to be self disciplined as well as self reliant is part of it. I try to not necessarily to only think independently or to rely only on myself, but to build the confidence to do so, to feel that I can take an active role in my own life rather than the role of a spectator, you know, as you would watching a movie.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so those are the things that I like to keep in mind um, in practicing my idea of healthy masculinity.
Okay. It's it's interesting because these are things that a lot of men express in their own way, and sometimes you see the toxicity permeating through like some type of distorted idea of how you should execute that confidence, for example, that it's misinterpreted as cockiness or an
Mhm,
over self-reliance that I don't need anyone, and then goes the
mhm,
whole repressing emotions and stuff like that. That leads to the rabbit hole
mhm,
that ends a lot of times, sadly, and people unaliving themselves. Um,
mhm,
so yeah, it is an interesting dynamic because how do we express our masculinity the way we want to, the ideal way for us? Because it's an individual experience at the end of the day. You can see the
mhm,
male gaze, female gaze, traditional masculinity roles, traditional masculinity habits and stuff like that, hegemonic masculinity, alternative masculinity. There's a whole lot of ways that you can practice it. Mainly the whole project of the podcast and stuff like that is basically to say like, yo, you don't have to renounce your masculinity. You can practice it as you want, and it's just as valid as the
mhm,
people who want to be as traditional as possible. Because either way, you're going to be affected by the patriarchy. Either way, you're going to experience and manifest your own types of toxic masculinity, whether you want it or not, because that's part of the whole deconstruction process. So yeah, it's been an amazing, like to close it out the episode. It's been an amazing conversation as always with you. I
mhm.
would like for you to, if you want to say like a closing statement or stuff like that, to leave the viewer with something to think about.
Really, in terms of keeping things in mind in order to perhaps further your understanding or even your curiosity towards that gender spectrum, and especially the one leaning more towards masculinity, I would say it's important to keep an open mind because most of our conceptions of masculinity are things that we ultimately have to unlearn if we want to reach that my ideal, I guess. If I In order for me to reach my own ideal of masculinity, that being a mature individual. um but independent of what might what somebody might consider masculine over another, gender roles and normalized conceptions of masculinity are not necessarily all there is.
Mhm.
In fact, the word normal in and of itself is kind of pointless, really. Um, one needs to be flexible and open to experiencing new things. And it's okay to modify your own conception of masculinity as that aligns with you as a person. Um, and either way, if there needs to be some kind of loyalty in terms of conception of the self and fealty to a specific identity, it should be your own rather than just a specific set of traditional values that construe our ideas of gender and the binary or otherwise. So be kind to yourself. It's important to be kind to yourself. I have to take my own advice in that regard, but
We all do. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Be kind to yourself. It's okay to ask questions about yourself to yourself and remain compassionate towards each other. And
It's interesting because you say like, the importance of being your own ideal man, not
mhm,
the ideal man, because that is a shifting concept throughout centuries. Like the ideal
mhm,
man today wasn't the ideal man 20 years ago, and we see that in fact, and this narrative that men aren't like they used to. That's been said
mhm,
generation through generation, like always, and there's the whole like strong men create easy times create weak men create hard times. That whole debacle, I feel like it's complete
mhm,
BS. That's how you interpret society and history and all the historical conflicts we've had. But if you have a confirmation bias, you're gonna arrive at the conclusion you want to arrive, basically.
mhm,
So yeah, that whole self-kindness thing that we should practice is very important because no matter what you do. And this is like basically based on the research I've observed. If you try to be as traditional as possible, that has severe consequences, either socially, romantically, psychologically, or stuff like that. If you don't know how to be as traditional as possible, that could arise a few negative consequences, like, for example, low self-esteem and stuff like that, before you truly discover what type of man you want to be. And after that, and I've said this a few times, I think feminism has a little bit of, how you say it, breach in the knowledge in terms of it is great for signaling out the negative aspects of masculinity, but when it comes to providing a model to practice healthy masculinity, a lot of times it's based on don't do the negative stuff. But you can't just not do
mhm,
the negative stuff. You need to know what to do to be positive and stuff
mhm.
like that. And
Exactly.
sometimes it feels like you have to renounce your masculinity to be positive, and that's a whole other issue in and of itself. So yeah, whole part of this is basically to be kind to yourself, to practice introspection and actually reach some type of ideal of your own masculinity. It's been an amazing conversation. I hope we can repeat it with other topics in future episodes. We're gonna leave it here. It's the first ever episode I do in English, so let's see how it goes after editing it. Just to close out the episode, I would like to announce this episode does not replace therapy. If you feel like you need therapeutic services, please contact your medical provider, or anyone you think that can help you reach those services. This has been Masculinity 98. It's a pleasure having you, William. Thank you always for being so kind with me. So yeah, this is the episode. Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you and bye.